If it's quite new that the federal government is talking about land back, it is not new that Indigenous peoples are. With us now for some perspective on that, in the provincial capital, Pamela Palmater, professor and chair in Indigenous Governance at Ryerson University, and Riley Yesno, research fellow at the Yellowhead Institute and a PhD student in political science at the University of Toronto, investigating Indigenous social movements. And it's good to have you two back on TVO tonight. Let me just start by I really want to get your understanding of what you think land back means and sort of compare it to what the minister thinks it means. Pamela, get us started here. What do those two words mean to you?
Well, to us, it's the same thing that it's meant since basically after contact, that it's land back, like actual land back. It's actual resources back. It's respect for our right to be self-determining. It's our children back, our women back. All of the things that Canada has tried to take from us, we just want that back. Does it mean that non-Native people are kicked out of their homes? Absolutely not, because the majority of lands in Canada are held by governments.
Okay, that's a lot more than just land, so that's good to get that clarified. Your definition of it obviously goes much beyond the simple return of land. Riley, let me get you on the record on that as well.
Yeah. I would say that my definition is quite similar in the same spirit. I kind of define land back usually as any action that centers placing jurisdiction, authority, resources back into the hands of Indigenous people. So especially those things that were harmed or taken through colonialism. And like Pam said, it is more than just it is more than just land, and it is something that we can chart through a long history of Indigenous contestation marked by a very distinctly anti-colonial spirit. And so anything that you can identify that in, I think often constitutes land back.
Okay, for the moment, let us just focus on the actual land itself, though. And Pamela, I'll pick this up with you. And you hinted at it in your first answer. If you are a non-Indigenous person watching this or listening to this, you may be very skeptical about how the notion of land back won't be a bad thing for you. Can you explain to that audience how this may actually be a good thing for them?
Oh, it's a good thing in so many ways. So first of all, it's not taking their land or property away from them. Governments can compensate us for lands that we can't have. But it's about things like joint governance. It's about community building. It's about sharing the resources. And it's also about addressing climate change. If you think about Indigenous peoples who are on the front line trying to protect the lands from contamination and waters from being poisoned, that benefits everyone. And the way to do that is to respect and honor land back for Indigenous peoples.
Riley, could you pick up on that? Is there anything you'd add?
Yeah, I think that there's often a misunderstanding on the part of people who are skeptical of land back. One is this practical understanding that most of Canada is not private property. So the lands that we're often talking about in land back is not, it's not necessarily your cottage or downtown Toronto, but instead the majority of Canadian land, which is currently Crown land. So practically, I think the picture of what land we're talking about is often misconstrued. But also, I think that there's often this very violent, misplaced logic that makes people scared to embrace land back. And that stems from this place, I think, that they think that if Indigenous people were to regain authority, were to regain jurisdiction, that we would do the same thing to them that colonizers did to us. And that, is just completely wrong. It is never the vision that Indigenous people had about living on the land together. We can look at the earliest treaties, the two-row wampum belt, and see that there was always a vision of living together collaboratively with reciprocity, sharing in a peaceful way, informed by friendship and respect. And so, this logic that somehow it would be bad for them is, I think, a colonial myth.
Maybe you could, as long as you've got the floor, Riley, just take us back, because you did touch on a bit of a history lesson there. Go back in time. How did the Crown end up being responsible for / governing over unceded territory to begin with? Take us back.
Yeah, so the treaty that I mentioned is the two-row wampum belt. That's a treaty made between the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch, actually. And what it symbolizes, though, is you'll see two rows of purple beads that represent the settler and the indigenous ways of knowing, of governance, of existing on the land, shared on the belt, and in between principles of, as I mentioned, peace, friendship, and reciprocity. So that's sometimes considered the earliest treaty between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in North America. But go forward about 100, 200 years in there, we get things like the Royal Proclamation. We get things like the numbered treaties, and we know that oftentimes those original principles that I just described became abandoned on the part of settlers, became misconstrued in people's minds. And when treaties, which would become, the basis for a lot of the governing relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people were signed, they were deliberately, misinterpreted, that they were signed under conditions of duress, oftentimes. And so we see over the course of a couple hundred years, this slow leaving of those original principles that, could have made Canada something entirely different than what it is now.
And Pamela, perhaps you could pick up the story and talk about the situations where land was, by treaty, ceded. There was an agreement, and then if you would sort of characterize how well or not you think those treaties are working today.
I think that's one of the most important questions for Canadians to actually understand, because we know there's parts of Canada where there's no treaties. We know there's parts of Canada where there are pre-Confederation treaties that don't talk about land, but the numbered treaties have always been alleged to have ceded lands, and there's treaties here in Ontario that are alleged to have ceded lands. Well, the United Nations did a study on this in the 1990s and traveled to countries all over the world with colonial governments and Indigenous populations and looked at treaties and agreements. And based on all the evidence they collected from governments and the historical record and Indigenous peoples, they came to the conclusion that there was no coming to the minds, no mutual understanding of lands being ceded. And in fact, if we were to put that before a court that was unbiased, those land cession portions in those treaties would not stand up to the law, because there was things like undue duress, there was purposeful mistranslations, there was forced starvations, all of those things which vitiate consent in law, even back then.
So Pamela, in your view then, and again, if an unbiased, as you put it, court were to look at it today, what do you believe the state of those lands today to be?
Well, I think they're all unceded. Any pre-Confederation or historical treaty, they are all unceded lands, which means they're Aboriginal title lands. Does that change the fact that we are in treaty relationships? Absolutely not. We work together, live together, we're intermarried, we're trying to work together on a nation-to-nation basis. But in terms of whose land is it, I think there's absolutely no question in international law or Indigenous law and growing here in Canada that it's Indigenous land.
All right. Riley, let me get you back in here. The minister, whom we just spoke to, says that this land ownership issue is complicated, and it is not simply, because I put it to him, I said, if you want to give land back, here's the deed, give it back. And he said, well, it's a little more complicated than that. Is it more complicated than that in your view?
In my view, not really. I mean, I think that the government would really like us to think that it's much more of a complex process than it is, when in fact, Indigenous people all across Turtle Island right now are living sovereignty. They know that they have jurisdiction and authority over their land. They are practicing their governing relations in a traditional way in many cases. We can just take Wet'suwet'en out west, an example many folks would know, for example. But so it's not a matter of like, how do we get them to do it? Indigenous people are already doing it. It's just a matter of the government respecting them doing that. And that's where it seems to get that complicated sort of narrative around it. I think I'm very worried at this stage that the government is going to co-opt the meaning of land back to be things like addition to reserve processes, make land claims go through the courts faster. But when it comes down to Indigenous people just enacting sovereignty without asking for permission, that's where we will continue to see violence and disrespect and a refusal to actually engage in meaningful nation-to-nation relationships. And so I think it's a lot simpler, actually, than perhaps Minister Miller makes it out to be.
Well, okay, let me pursue that with Pamela, because, of course, you know, Minister Miller is taking into account there are government departments and courts and land title and ownership and treaties and on and on and on, and First Nations that have to be negotiated with and so on. So the way he portrays it, it does sound complicated. Pamela, is it as simple as saying, this is your land, we have it now, we want to give it back to you, here it is? Is it more complicated than that?
Not at its core. And that's the thing. You can make this as difficult and time intensive and expensive as you want to as a government, or you can come to the table and do lots of things in the interim. For example, let the Wet'suwet'en Nation govern their own territory. Let the Mi'kmaq Nation govern their own territory. You can do things like exempt them from different laws. You can do things like start sharing resources right away that doesn't require any negotiations. When you're talking about which territories and where we're going to have shared jurisdiction and exclusive jurisdiction for government, sure, that's going to be sitting down at the table and talking about that. However, there's nothing stopping them now from actually respecting the fact that it's our land and that we have the right to protect it if we want to, and that we have the right to have internal discussions or disagreements or work things out for ourselves if we want to. And it is as simple as that. They just choose not to.
Well, okay, let me understand that better, Pamela, because you're saying there's nothing stopping them now from doing just that. But it isn't happening. So something's stopping them. What do you think is stopping them?
Well, we all know all of this has been very much politicized, and they cater very much. Keep in mind, this is about politics. This is also about elections, and they carry very much to massive transnational corporations who believe they have interests in our territories, who are making tons of money off our territories. It's also about the different politics across the country, their voter base, whether that would ring favorably or not. All of the considerations that are, in fact, not relevant to an idea of land back and what they could do right now. And I think it's also very important for our viewers to understand that Canada has now declared that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is applicable law in Canada. That protects our rights to govern all of our traditional lands and resources. So the minimum standard now has been raised, and Canada's just a little bit slow on the draw to get to it.
Yeah, Roddy, can you pick up on that? Canada has signed on to UNDRIP. What does that obligate the government of Canada to do that, in your view, it is not yet doing?
Yeah, I mean, so UNDRIP is a little bit out of my realm of expertise. However, from my understanding, it's exactly what Pam was just talking about, right? Like about ensuring our rights, making sure that in the most global of senses, that it's understood that we have a right to govern ourselves, we have a right to live good lives on our territory, we have a right to be authorities over our own lands and our resources, whether we do or do not want to engage in resource extraction processes, etc. And those are all conditions that are repeatedly violated by the Canadian state, by the Canadian government. We can see it in Wet'suwet'en, we can see it at 1492 Land Back Lane, repeatedly throughout history. And even after the point where Canada was supposed to accept UNDRIP, do they continue to renege on those obligations? That would make that land back actually falls very, very nicely into what UNDRIP is trying to secure for Indigenous people.
I should actually get off this path right now because we've got another guest coming up right after you two who will speak to the UNDRIP situation. So I'm going to hold off on that for now and pursue that more with our next guest. But Pamela, tell me this. I do hear anecdotes from time to time about, for example, non-Indigenous Canadians saying that when they die, they will in their will, pass on, for example, their cottages to the local First Nations as a way of making land back truly happen if not necessarily in their lifetime, but then at some point in the life of the community. I hear that anecdotally. How much of that is going on actually?
I've actually seen it happen in different places across the country. I get contacted by private citizens and businesses who hold land saying, what do I do? I have this land, some of which I want to give land back to the local First Nation now, some of which I could bequeath in my will or when the lease is up or all of these other things. And I always direct them to the local First Nation. And I think that's key that you brought that up, Steve, because everybody is involved in making reparations for generations of genocide and the benefit that settlers have had. Does that mean that they should give away all their land? No, of course not. Nobody's asking for that. No one's trying to push them out of any resource industries or anything else. This is just about fairness and what can you do? And some people have lots of plots of land. There's businesses who have unused land. It's such an easy thing to do in the here and now.
So, Riley, if you are a non-Indigenous Canadian and you are watching or listening to this and you think maybe government is dragging its feet a little too much on this, this is a real option, in your view, for non-Indigenous Canadians to take. Have I got that right?
Certainly, yes. And it doesn't have to just be, the bequeathing of land, because I think that oftentimes when we think of it like that, it can become, a project that's only available to the elite or to wealthy folks. But every single person has a role to play in land back. And so that could be, yes, doing something physical like the return of land or, making monthly donations to land trusts, which do exist all across Turtle Island as well. But there are other things you can do, right? Like when Indigenous people in your communities, in your proximity, are fighting for assertion of their rights, you can show up physically with your time, with your vote. You can show up and just do something as simple as pass out signs and keep the fire going. And that allows Indigenous land defenders to continue doing their work. When you go onto Indigenous territories, you can know and understand and follow their rules of law, just as you do the Canadian rules of law. That is affirming and legitimizing Indigenous people as, the governing authorities of their land. And so it can be those everyday sort of actions as opposed to also these grand gestures, which, are welcome but aren't necessarily accessible to every person.
Gotcha. All right, we've got a few minutes left here, and we have talked a lot about specifically land back so far. But Pamela, in your first answer, you did touch on the fact that land back, in your understanding of that term, goes much beyond that. And I wonder if you could pick up the story there. Beyond specifically the land, what else would you like to see happen? Over to you on beyond the actual land.
Okay. In addition to land, it also means resources back. Think about the vast natural resources all over the country, but not just natural resources, because not all Indigenous peoples want to extract natural resources like it's been done right now. It's also about the massive wealth that's been generated all over our territories. So a fair share of taxes, fees, license, permits, all of those things, that royalties, everything, all the wealth that's generated and collected on our territories, especially from governments, a fair share needs to go to First Nation governments from whose those lands are being shared. And that is part of making sure that we have the wealth from our own territories to make our nation sustainable. And that's literally critical going forward. It doesn't change anything for non-Indigenous peoples. This is about government saying, yes, of all of these taxes, First Nations get a share of all of these things, plus any other wealth that's generated.
Just out of curiosity, Pamela, if negotiations are ongoing, how do you, I don't know if you've got spies in the room or not, but how do you keep up to date with where things are at?
Well, I work with a lot of First Nations all across the country, and obviously First Nations advisors and lawyers and things like that. And we know that although Canada says things like, oh, yes, we want to do land back, and yes, we're changing the land claim process, at the heart of what they're doing is trying to get First Nations to cede, surrender, and extinguish all of their rights to their territories and their resources in exchange for a package, so that you're no longer the true governor over the territory or your resources, but you're getting something back from Canada, obviously, which is far less. And they've tried to change the wording to say, oh, we don't do that anymore, but they do. They make you sign the agreement, and in the event that you don't follow this agreement, you've ceded and surrendered and extinguished your rights. And that's a fundamental problem with the current negotiations.
Riley, let me just finish up with you on this, and that is, I'm going to put an analogy to you, and I want you to tell me whether this makes sense or not, whether the analogy works in this case. And I'm going to pluck something out of the not too long ago history and go to South Africa in doing so. And I want to know whether you think, if there were the possibility of land back and a genuine agreement with the government of Canada, which left both sides coming away from the table satisfied, would you put that as akin to the end of apartheid in South Africa? Would it be something that significant?
Yeah, well, and I mean, it's I always think African comparisons are illuminating, because the model for apartheid in South Africa was actually built off of the Indian Act, which is still a piece of Canadian legislation today. And so I think that it would at least be, a necessary component of ending the ongoing dispossession and oppression and genocide of Indigenous people in the country. You cannot end a genocide against Indigenous people without returning their capacity, their authority, their legitimacy to them. And so, Canada cannot return legitimacy to Indigenous people. They already have it, but, affirming that and respecting it. And so, yes, I do think it would be an essential part of that project.
Gotcha. Pamela Palmater and Riley Yesno, who still has, in my view, the best Twitter handle ever. Yesno, maybe. That is the best. I want to thank both of you for coming on to TVO tonight and sharing your views on this. It's been very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you much.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.